class, I hope that you all had a lovely break. You may notice that I am wearing more dressy clothes in this video. I'm trying to lean into the professor bit a little bit more with the aesthetics in this one, so hopefully that's something that y'all like. Now, for me, I was watching YouTube the other night, and I came across this video titled Rotten Tomatoes Won't Exist in 5 Years. Here's Why, by the creator Moon. And it really got my goat enough that I felt like I had to talk about it, at least so that I can get my goat back. At the outset, I assumed that the video would be your average company man style video that I occasionally like to watch, which basically gives the Wikipedia spiel on the background of a company and offers relatively milquetoast explanations as to why said company may or may not have experienced a downfall. Now, I'm certainly not opposed to explanations more interesting than the ones in the company man style videos. I would even say that I welcome them. But seeing Moon's explanation was shocking and upsetting, not only for its use of talking points founded on bigotry, but also for its clear lack of any substantive evidence. So today, I thought that we could go through the video and break it down, discussing the drawbacks and merits of his argument along the way. It's going to become clearer as we go along in this video why I think that this is an important video to respond to, but the first bit of the video might seem a little unnecessary. I promise though, it has a point and it is going somewhere. But if you want to skip to the juiciest bits, go to this timestamp in the video. Maybe there? Maybe there-ish? Alright, let's watch.
When Netflix released Cuties, a film glamorizing underage strippers, Rotten Tomatoes gave it an 86% certified fresh rating. But when it came to the audience and actual real people, the show only got a 15% rating. Then when Dave Chappelle came along and said some edgy jokes, he got a 0% score from Rotten Tomatoes. And surprise surprise, he got an audience score of 99%. So why is there such a big difference in these scores? And what's happened to Rotten Tomatoes? Rotten Tomatoes used to be a well-respected site. It was used in marketing, billboards, studios even put their scores in movie posters.
Now, I'll discuss the discrepancy between audience and critic scores on Rotten Tomatoes in further detail a bit later on. Right off the bat, though, Moon makes the assertion that Rotten Tomatoes used to be a well-respected site. The evidence that he uses to support this is that the site was used in marketing, billboards, and movie posters. But does this mean that the site was well-respected by the movie-going population as a whole? Not really. It just means that Rotten Tomatoes was supported by the movie industry. And one could make the argument that that's what Moon means when he says well-respected. Just that studios respected it. What he's really doing here, then, is making the assertion that the opinion of studios is the general opinion of moviegoers. And I don't see anything wrong with making that argument, that those are equivalent, as long as he remains consistent on that point. Remember that groundwork that he's laying here. The opinions of institutions, in this case movie studios, are the opinions that matter. Let's see where he goes from here.
If you wanted to know whether a movie was really worth watching, then Rotten Tomatoes could tell you, and this made the site wildly popular. Over time, the site grew to become one of the largest review sites around. However, today, it's a whole other story. Rotten Tomatoes is everything it once stood against. So how did one of the most respected sites on the internet lose all of its reputation in a matter of a couple of years? Well, to understand this, we need to understand what made Rotten Tomatoes so successful in the first place. You see, Rotten Tomatoes isn't unique as a site that aggregates other reviews, but it is unique in how it rates its movies. The system is basically a fancy version of thumbs up, thumbs down. If a movie gets over 60% good reviews, then Rotten Tomatoes will give it a fresh rating. If it gets lower than 60, then it's rotten. But there's a third rating. A movie can be certified fresh if it gets 5 good reviews from top critics, a greater than 75% average rating, and a minimum amount of overall reviews. Through this method, Rotten Tomatoes hopes to give people at least some insight into the quality of a movie. Now, this obviously isn't a perfect system, no method would be. But within this seemingly simple solution lies some massive problems.
Before I watched this video, I had really thought that the problem with the system was pretty widely known. It's just brutish and imprecise. I'm going to address this in a little more depth later when Moon gets on the topic of Rotten Tomatoes' actual scoring methodology, but for now just know that I'm not a huge fan of it.
and the first of these came to light all the way back in 2017. You see, every year there's major blockbuster releases during the summer, and it's these massive movies that the film industry relies on. In fact, they make up 40% of all ticket sales. But when the summer of 2017 came round, there were more misses than hits. Although some films performed well, most were flops. Baywatch bombed, King Arthur bombed, the sequels to the Pirates of the Caribbean and Transformers all bombed, and the summer studios were taking huge hits. But there was one thing that all of these movies had in common: an awful Rotten Tomatoes score. And it was also during this exact same summer that Rotten Tomatoes grew massively, seeing a 32% increase in traffic just compared to the year before. And it didn't take long for the studios to put two and two together, and soon they were out for blood.
Okay, hold up real quick. Could it be possible that these are just bad movies that people don't really want to see? I mean, did anyone ask for a Baywatch sequel? Baywatch is pretty much just nostalgia porn for boomers and Gen Xers, and it doesn't really have that much appeal to the younger audiences of today that make up the largest share of theater goers. Transformers, I mean, the Transformers movies have been poorly acted, lazily plotted, corporate advertisements since the franchise's start, and all of that only got more egregious as the series went on. I think it might be fair to say that people just got sick of paying to be pushed products over the scaffolding of a movie with little to no artistic value. I mean, you could watch a fucking building demolition that's more entertaining than Transformers and has basically the same content without the corporate advertising. You know, in fact, the assertion that bad Rotten Tomatoes scores tanked the Transformers franchise is patently ridiculous, given that the films got rotten scores from the beginning, yet continued to rake in massive sums of cash anyhow. Even The Last Night, while tanking in North America, still managed to bring in double its budget worldwide. What I'm trying to show here is that the connection between bad Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office revenue is shoddy at best, and easily refuted just by looking slightly deeper into the specific examples that Moon uses here. So many movies with bad Rotten Tomatoes scores have done so well. I know I'm cherry-picking a bit with my examples here, but I think it does go to show that Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office revenue don't have such a clear correlation as Moon presents here. Furthermore, alternative explanations for these movies' box office failures are just as, if not more, plausible than blaming Rotten Tomatoes. Maybe people just don't want a bunch of unnecessary, pandering sequels out of Hollywood, and the critics just happen to agree with that? But I guess we'll never know what people think about this. It's not like the poor quality of sequels and reboots is widely acknowledged and discussed or anything.
Bitch, please, you must be smoking rock.
Brett Ratner, a director and producer, claimed that Rotten Tomatoes was the destruction of our business, and in a lot of ways he wasn't wrong, as so many people were now relying on the site for prior judgment before purchasing a ticket, and it made people that much more apprehensive about seeing films. No one wanted to waste 2 hours on a film that Rotten Tomatoes deemed bad, and because of the controversy surrounding Rotten Tomatoes' harsh scores, this actually improved Rotten Tomatoes' standing. Seeing it fight against the mediocre and bad drivel that Hollywood tries to shove down people's throats was seemingly refreshing, and the site continued to grow from here.
Okay, just a few quick points here. One, he says that the studios weren't wrong about bad Rotten Tomatoes scores undermining their business, yet the evidence that he provides for this statement is just the assumption that it's true. Of course people were relying more on Rotten Tomatoes to guide which movies they would watch, he says, yet we have nothing to show that they actually were. You can't say that something is happening just because you think it's happening. That is an opinion. You have made an opinion, not a fact. And second, remember earlier when Moon used Studios' own acceptance of Rotten Tomatoes as the basis of the assertion that Rotten Tomatoes was widely respected? Well, now he's saying that they were widely respected because of Rotten Tomatoes pushing back against the studios. So which is it? Whose opinion is representative of the whole here? Moon doesn't really seem to care. Whatever opinion supports the point that he's trying to make at the time is what he's going to use, even if it's inconsistent with his earlier statements, which this clearly is. It might seem like I'm going too far in nitpicking what is, at the end of the day, just a YouTube video, and so far, seemingly a relatively innocuous one, but I think that it's important to pick up on the sort of logic and reasoning that is being used at this point in the video, so that we can clearly see the baselessness of his more egregious claims later in the video, that build off of the reasoning and evidence used in this first section.
However, within the attacks, there lay some valid criticism for the site, and the first of these was about to make waves. You see, as Rotten Tomatoes was growing, one of the most well-respected people in film would come to completely denounce the site. In fact, Martin Scorsese was one of the biggest critics of the site. In an article on the issues with Rotten Tomatoes, Scorsese called the current way of doing things brutal judgmentalism, where he claimed that the site had taken the actual content and thoughtful criticism out of the picture, instead replacing it with a system that amounts to a simple yes or no question, where a plethora of insightful opinions and comments are ground down and fed into a machine, and at the end, a number pops out that tells you whether a movie is good or not. Scorsese calls the process insulting, and when films come out that defy easy categorism, the system treats them incredibly unfairly. It slaps them with a bad or rotten rating, discouraging anyone in the public from actually opening themselves up to the experience. And often these films aren't immediately liked, but are later realized to be masterpieces. Scorsese used the example of It's a Wonderful Life and Vertigo to illustrate this. But possibly the last thing that Scorsese says about Rotten Tomatoes has ended up being almost prophetic. You see, the site was incredibly popular in 2017 when the article was written, but Scorsese was foreshadowing that the site wasn't going to stick around for too much longer, and we're witnessing the process unfold before our very eyes.
For the most part, I do agree with Scorsese here. Rotten Tomatoes' scoring system is oversimplified and really makes no sense at all. Let's compare it to its biggest competitor, Metacritic. Metacritic takes a selection of approved critics' scores for each movie, and then averages out the scores that each critic gave to the movie. Say that 3 mainstream critics reviewed a given movie. In this scenario, let's assume that one of these critics gave the movie a 60%, another gave the movie a 65%, and the third gave the movie a 70%. Metacritic would then take the scores of the 3 critics and average those scores out, giving the movie an overall score of 65%. For Rotten Tomatoes, on the other hand, any score above a 59% is considered a positive score, and is lumped together with all of the other positive scores, regardless of their specific percentage. So, if Rotten Tomatoes used the same 3 critics' reviews mentioned earlier, it would give the movie an overall score of 100%, a perfect score. However, the critics clearly didn't praise the movie that highly. Because of this ranking system, Rotten Tomatoes obscures actual critical opinions of the movie. A 60% score is not the same as a 100% score, and it'd be ridiculous to treat it as such. Yet Rotten Tomatoes does just that, and even for its certified fresh score, it treats a 75% and 100% as the same. For this reason, even many critics don't care much for the site's ranking system. I mean, y'all remember how we were graded in school, right? At least for us who grew up in the US. Above a 90% is an A, above an 80% is a B, and so on down to 60%. Below which everything is an F. Well, that's not a great grading system, but at least it recognized just how different a 60% and 100% is. Very different. That's the difference between a D and an A+. Man, that's failing versus passing. Completely different. Now, how this oversimplified score influences movie-watching behavior and audience perceptions is very much up for debate, and from what I could find, there just isn't enough good evidence to make an assertion of causation in this regard. I did find multiple articles, both academic and journalistic, that address this subject, but their conclusions swung wildly, from the assertion that critical reviews have a marginal impact on box office revenues, to the assertion that they have no impact whatsoever. Stepping back from speculation on box office score correlations, I want to be clear on my opinion of Rotten Tomatoes. I am no fanboy. In fact, I think that Rotten Tomatoes does a poor job at its only job, and has little more than marketing going for it. I think that a more effective site would prioritize the nuance in critical and audience reviews, rather than obscuring it. Or at least aggregate reviews in a reasonable way, like Metacritic does. Rotten Tomatoes is a bad, oversimplified portrayal of film criticism that is itself often thoughtful and nuanced, and it therefore isn't a very helpful indicator of movie quality. How that might affect box office revenue or audience behavior, though, is hard to say, given conflicting studies on the matter.
However, back in this time, Rotten Tomatoes was in its golden years. And a year later, it seemed like Scorsese was wrong. In fact, they found there was virtually no correlation between Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office numbers. And this was proven the next year, when movie box office numbers skyrocketed to record heights, proving that the site wasn't the problem that people thought it was. But the trouble was that this only really applied when Rotten Tomatoes gave accurate pictures of what people actually liked.
Now, as you can see here, Moon does cite a study that found that the positivity of reviews didn't correlate with box office revenue. However, he then goes on to say that the study found that this only applied to movies where Rotten Tomatoes gave an accurate picture of what audiences actually liked, i.e., movies whose critics and audience scores on Rotten Tomatoes were similar. But this isn't what the article he cites says. The article simply says that Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office revenues aren't correlated at all. Regardless, the next section in the article does address the correlation between audience and critic scores, but it actually shows that audience and critic scores are highly correlated for movies grossing more than $300 million. I would say that this disproves his point that critics and audiences have divergent opinions on blockbusters. But this article is from 2017, and I can't speak to recent data. So let's take a step back and look at this again, now that we know what the article is actually communicating. Moon is saying that if audience and critic scores are similar, there won't be a correlation between Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office returns, so Rotten Tomatoes can't be blamed for those movies' box office failures, if they did indeed fail at the box office. I think that's why he says that in 2017 there was little difference between audience and critical scores, to show that Rotten Tomatoes wasn't yet an issue. Yet the very movies that he had used earlier to demonstrate that there was a growing problem with Rotten Tomatoes in 2017 do show a wide variation between audience and critical scores. In making the point that if audience and critic scores are similar for box office failures, Rotten Tomatoes can't be blamed for those movies' low revenues. Furthermore, Moon is implying that Rotten Tomatoes can be blamed for poor box office revenues if critics and audience scores are dissimilar, which he's arguing is the primary growing issue with Rotten Tomatoes. To put it simply, Moon is associating Rotten Tomatoes with good things, provided that Rotten Tomatoes critics' scores agree with its audience scores, and with bad things, provided that the critics' scores and audience scores disagree. Yet the article doesn't say any of this, and the data used in the article don't show it. Instead, we again see Moon skimming over important information in a study that most people won't be bothered to actually read and interpret, because by using a study as evidence, his demonization of Rotten Tomatoes seems well-founded, and people in the comments of this video fall for the trap, praising how well-researched the video is. Yet we can see here that it's a ruse, a trick that he's playing on the audience while he pushes unfounded claims demonizing Rotten Tomatoes. This is a tactic that Moon displays over and over again in this video. As we can see, he's building his argument on a foundation of lies. So, as Moon transitions us into an ad read, we have to wonder, why is he doing this? Is the existence of a chasm between critics and audience scores really that important? Will critics and audience scores be divergent with greater frequency past 2017, as it seems he's leading us to think? If so, why?
Hey, it's me in the editing booth. Just a quick comment on Moon's ad read. I wasn't going to address his ad read on Masterworks, the art investment platform, in the video because I didn't really want to look into it, but I definitely got sort of scammy vibes from the company at the beginning, and I was like, oh, of course Moon's promoting this, basically scam company that probably isn't going to get you very good returns on your investment. But couldn't be bothered. But then I saw this video by the Plain Bagel on Masterworks and the issues with it. So I'm just going to put that in there. I'm going to put a link in the description for y'all. Just check it out. Just another thing to add on to just the fuckery that is this video. So enjoy.
Access to their new offerings by clicking the link in the description below. You see, the University of Southern California had done a study on Rotten Tomatoes critics in 2017, and it showed that over 80% of them were white and 78% were men. Now, this whole study was doubtlessly politically motivated. I mean, the University of Southern California is one of the most woke places imaginable, and this was all happening during 2018, when the culture war was in full swing, and Trump had been in office for 2 years, and both sides were looking for more and more targets. And so the radical left would criticize Rotten Tomatoes for being the product of straight white men.
Okie dokie. Clearly a lot to unpack here. First off, he dismisses the study from the University of California on the basis that USC is, and I quote, one of the most woke places imaginable. His logic for dismissing the study is that it is politically motivated and part of the culture war. In general terms, what he's doing here is saying that if a study is done by a biased party, that study is entirely flawed and should be thrown out entirely. I do agree that it's fair to question the validity of a study done by a biased party, but if you do that, you still have to find flaws within the study itself. Finding a conflict of interest is only a starting point. But in order to criticize the study, I think that you should actually, read the study and find the flaws within it. Yet he stops at the starting point and acts like that explains the whole thing away.
Also, another quick point to throw in here. The study that I was just talking about for minutes on end that Moon used to prove that when audiences and critics agree, it doesn't have an effect on box office revenues. At least that was his point. That article, who works at USC, University of Southern California. So shouldn't that be dismissed entirely? Because it's from the University of Southern California, which is very woke, and I don't think that Moon should be using studies from there, to support his claims, because it's just so woke.
I also take issue with his both sidesing. We've seen it a million times before. People equate those on both sides of a conflict or issue, often making the explicit assertion that the existence of conflict between the two sides is more important than what the conflict is about. In doing this, they also shoehorn in the implicit assumption that neither side is better than the other. But this is dismissing everything that the culture war is about. Racial, sexual, gender, ethnic, and class discrimination, inequality, and inequity. Those are real, powerful, and important issues in our society. Dismissing these issues to instead argue that the culture war is the real issue isn't a neutral approach, as much as someone like Moon would like you to think that it is. Instead, this approach is taking the side of the right wing, who benefit from arguments that dismiss societal marginalization, because their goal is to maintain the white supremacist, capitalist status quo. And I think that they should be called out for that, because hiding behind this argument that the culture war is the ultimate devil is frankly cowardly bullshit.
And of all of the things, this would end up destroying Rotten Tomatoes. At the time Rotten Tomatoes protested the study, they said that they chose their critics from generally accepted large media outlets. They claimed the facts was just a reflection on the industry rather than them. And whilst this was just completely true,
I think that we're starting to see some patterns emerge in this half of the video, particularly in how Moon hides right-wing talking points in statements of fact. His argument here is that it's fair for Rotten Tomatoes to use a pool of largely white and male critics for their aggregate rankings because that's representative of the industry. The dismissive way in which he makes this statement, in fact, pushes the audience to accept it as common sense that an industry dominated by white men not only does, but should only be criticized at the mainstream level by other white men. But this doesn't really make any sense, does it? Even if the film industry is dominated by straight white men, why should the critics only be straight white men? Why should all other societal groups be cut out of the film industry entirely, either on the production side or the criticism side? Because don't get it twisted, that is what Moon is saying here, just by making this casual statement, that the film industry and those who discuss it in the mainstream should all be straight white men. And that's just straight up conservative white supremacy. Yet he hides these ideas very well in statements, and in a general framework that sound much more palatable. And that's part of what I think makes this sort of content so dangerous.
It didn't matter for their reputation from blue checkmark journalists. So to try and avoid cancellation, Rotten Tomatoes pledged to add 200 more critics to their site, with a focus on inclusivity in the choices. And this meant they added a large amount of critics from niche sites and obscure parts of the internet, all in order to make the sites more inclusive and woke. And so of course this lowered the standards of Rotten Tomatoes dramatically.
I'm sorry, why did having a more racially and sexually diverse critics pool lower Rotten Tomatoes standards dramatically? Because unless he has some good explanation for this, based on the critics' actual work, he's saying that straight white men just have higher standards than everyone else. And again, that's just straight up white supremacist bullshit. If I was being charitable, I might say that he's taking issue with Rotten Tomatoes opening up their critics pool to critics from smaller publications, many of which may be based entirely online, because smaller publications may not have the journalistic standards that larger ones do, due to their increased visibility. That's certainly how he's trying to frame it to us. However, I'd like to point out that he's given me no reason to be charitable here, because he doesn't make this distinction clear in any way. In fact, he seems generally allergic to providing clarification, definition, or details. But anyhow, even if I was being charitable in this regard, it wouldn't work, because we're literally only seconds past Moon berating what he calls blue checkmark journalists for trying to hold Rotten Tomatoes accountable for their lack of marginalized representation in their critics pool in the first place. So if he doesn't respect the position of large, respected publications, which blue checkmark journalists represent, it shouldn't matter to him that these new critics are writing for smaller publications. I mean, he should actually prefer that, right? So again, that leaves us with race and sexual orientation being the only important distinctions. So yes, the statement betrays clear bigotry.
And little did they know that this move towards inclusivity was the beginning of their downfall. Because after this change, an odd thing began happening. More and more movies became outliers, with audience and critic scores varying wildly. We've already mentioned Dave Chappelle's special on Cuties, but this was really only the tip of the iceberg. Throughout 2017 and 2018, the two scores only got further and further apart.
Oh, he's answered my question from the first part of this video, on why we should consider a chasm between critics and audience scores so important. Thank God. I guess it's a representation of wokeness, forced upon the people by institutions. Of course, he can't keep a consistent opinion on institutions, so let's just move on. I mean, are the scores really divergent anyway? The scores are divergent, as this article from Bloomberg shows. But if this is indeed due to critics pushing a woke agenda that the audience despises, that puts us in a troubling place. It means that even while critics or studios might be leaning towards better representation and progressive ideals in movies, audiences are taking the side of the reactionaries. Of course, this could also be due to sampling bias, wherein reactionaries are more likely to leave reviews on movies labeled woke, but we'll get into that more in a bit. So, let's continue watching and see if he can convince me that he's right, that wokeness is behind this gap in Rotten Tomatoes scores. Because even though he's clearly biased toward the right, that's what we do. We actually look at the evidence provided. Unlike him with the USC study, but whoa. Let's not get into that.
With Rotten Tomatoes now praising woke movies like The Last Jedi, with a 92% score, even though all audiences around the world hated the film.
I'm sorry, but all audiences? My guy, even in the picture you show, the majority of the audience gave the movie a positive review. Come on.
For crowbarring the worst kind of feminism and forcing political wokeness on its audience. Captain Marvel also suffered the same fate in 2020, with 79% of critics on Rotten Tomatoes giving a good review compared to 45% of the general public.
I'm not even going to ask what Moon would consider the worst kind of feminism, or on the flip side, what his idea of the best kind of feminism would be. However, I do want to take this moment to reflect on his video as a whole. The entire first half of this video relied on Rotten Tomatoes scores undermining box office revenue. Yet now, that entire line of thought is just completely gone. He talks about Captain Marvel suffering the fate of having divergent critical and audience scores, yet Captain Marvel made over $1 billion at the box office. I know that doesn't apply to his argument now, but why not? If he spent so much time discussing revenues in the beginning of the video, why won't he even consider them in his analysis now? And according to his logic from that first part of the video, since Captain Marvel has divergent critics and audience scores, shouldn't it be a box office failure? He also brings up cuties again here, in an attempt to paint wokeism as a movement disguising the advocacy for horrible things such as pedophilia behind the positive language of equality. Yet, if he had watched the movie, Moon would have seen that Cuties is, in fact, a critique of the sexualization of young women's bodies in France, taken from extensive research done by the writer and director, a black woman. In no way does that movie advocate for that sexualization, instead attempting to expose and counter it. The controversy over the movie came about due to Netflix promoting the movie with a sexually explicit picture without the knowledge of the director. When the media then began rightfully attacking the poster's portrayal of the young actresses, the director came under fire for it. This story is just another example of the repeated dynamic whereby white institutions directly harm black individuals, and in this case specifically a black woman, where the pattern is even more prevalent. And I think it's also worth noting that many of the primary critics of Cuties as being, a pedophilic movie were also supporters of QAnon. Do with that information what you will. Now, Moon clearly hasn't watched the movie or looked into the background of the controversy, and instead takes the right-wing take on it at face value, thus perpetuating white supremacy while hiding behind the language of anti-pedophilia, the exact flip of what he's accusing Cuties of doing. And boy, is this a pattern. If you want to learn more about this story, I'd suggest listening to the episode on it by the podcast Internet Hate Machine. I'll link it down in the description.
Rotten Tomatoes suddenly had a very big bias towards movies with a very clear political agenda. Even if it was a bad movie, as long as it was woke, it was rated highly. And the same can be said of some more controversial entertainment. Anything that went against the agenda was panned on Rotten Tomatoes.
I'll dive deeper into this in a little bit, but did you notice how he doesn't ever really explain what the woke agenda entails? It's the entire basis of his argument, yet he doesn't even give a quick explanation of it. Now, how much of that is poor writing, and how much of it is the assumption that his audience already has an image of what wokeness means in their own head that he doesn't want to contradict? Just hold that thought for now.
Ricky Gervais's 2018 Netflix special was loved by audiences, gaining a 90% rating, but the Rotten Tomato critics suddenly hated it, only giving it again 44%. Although how does this even make sense? Well, simply because Ricky Gervais was threatening the woke agenda, and as a result he was rewarded with a bad score.
Is that the only explanation for that divergence? Is it really? I think it's time to address audience bias, because it's a big piece of this divergence between scores that's missing here. I'll first give a quick definition of sampling bias. Sampling bias occurs when a sample does not accurately represent the characteristics of the population from which it was drawn. When this bias occurs, sample attributes are systematically different from the actual population values. Hence, sampling bias produces a distorted view of the population. Sampling bias often exists when population members have differing probabilities of participating. In other words, the study is more likely to select specific subgroups or people with particular attributes than others. I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. Audience members are most likely to watch a given movie when they expect that it'll be a movie they enjoy. For instance, a fan of science fiction is much more likely to go see a new science fiction movie than someone who isn't particularly interested in the genre. By the same logic, we can ascertain that the people who are most likely to see the Ricky Gervais special are those who are already fans of his work, or who already enjoy content similar to it. Critics, on the other hand, have to watch the Ricky Gervais special regardless of whether or not they're a fan of his. Just that matter of sampling bias alone could explain much of the discrepancy between audience and critical scores, especially in the genre of stand-up, which is heavily reliant on personal agreeability with the type of jokes that the comic makes. I certainly won't say that it explains all of it, but I do find it odd how Moon avoids this explanation and continues to throw out platitudes on wokeness that are completely unsupported by any real evidence, as if they're hard facts. And again, this is classic right-wing behavior, couched in the veneer of harmless company man-style YouTube video journalism.
But this sudden trend didn't go unnoticed. Around the internet forums and posts, memes, everyone was laughing at Rotten Tomatoes. It was just so ridiculous, the difference between critics and audience scores. And their reputation would only get worse from here, because on average, these critics were starting to give better and better reviews, at least for all the boring trite entertainment, and over time this affected the averages. In 2009, for example, the average rating for a movie was 46%, and in the site's golden age, it hovered around that mark. But by 2019, the average had climbed all the way to 62. Were movies just getting better? Well, definitely not. It was because the site's critics were slowly getting more and more positive. Movies and TV shows that were almost universally considered bad or mediocre ended up getting good ratings, whereas actually edgy material that questioned the political narrative, would be stamped with a terrible score. So why was this happening? Well, it turns out that Rotten Tomatoes has a vested interest in giving trite, bland, woke movies good scores.
Who defines which movies are trite, bland, and woke? Is it Moon? Again, he just won't give us a definition of wokeness, and the only time he even came close is when he accused The Last Jedi of employing the worst kind of feminism. However, he does show us what he thinks unwoke movies are, those which consist of edgy material that actually questions the political narrative. And here's where I feel we should delve a little bit deeper into the right's conception of wokeness. Oxford Dictionary defines wokeness as the quality of being alert to and concerned about social injustice and discrimination. Given that the current political order was built on the enslavement of black people, the domination of all people by white men in power, and the exploitation of workers around the world, but specifically in majority non-white countries, I would say that bigoted men like Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle are actually upholding the current political order. It is, in fact, the so-called woke who are questioning the current political order and its domination by straight white men. What edgy material and its defenders like Moon does is paint upholding patriarchal conservatism as brave, because doing so flips the narrative. I mean, everyone wants to support the underdog, the victim of the cruel and dominating system. Yet men, and in particular white men, often don't want to hear that their domination of the system is the problem. So, edgy, anti-woke material tells them that all of the evidence of systemic racism and political and economic domination by white male elites is a false narrative designed as an attack on them, and that they're the actual victims, with the ever-elusive woke mob replacing white males as the oppressors. There's a ton of great material on LeftTube delving more deeply into this subject, and in particular I recommend this video by JD Signifier on Dave Chappelle, which I'll link down in the description. I also want to make it very clear just how overwhelming the evidence is that a white patriarchal capitalism is the real oppressor, and in the current status quo, that is the identity of the system. The woke mob is just a smokescreen to flip the narrative and Trojan horse extreme right-wing ideologies to mostly alienated young white men. It has nothing to do with reality, and more to do with continuing a centuries-long narrative, perpetuated by white men, demonizing those fighting for social justice. I'm just too goddamn tired to address his remarks on the She-Hulk, and I also haven't seen it for myself, so I honestly can't comment fairly on it, but I can link this great article from Screen Rant magazine in the description describing how audience hatred of the She-Hulk can be at least partially attributed to the show directly poking fun at incel and anti-woke ideology among comic book audiences.
Rotten Tomatoes has a vested interest in giving trite, bland, woke movies good scores, and that's because it's actually owned by Warner Bros. And the ticket company Fandango. After their purchase of the company in 2011, the scores magically creeped up, and apart from the increase in good reviews, it's hard to say what impact this purchase had on the site. But this isn't the only conflict of interest at Rotten Tomatoes. Paul Yanova, the president of Fandango, which partially owns Rotten Tomatoes, began his career and is well connected with the Disney executives. In fact, he spent over a decade working for the company before moving to Fandango and Rotten Tomatoes. And so with so many former movie executives running the company, it's no wonder they started playing nice with Hollywood. But this inflation of review scores is a worrying trend for the platform. If they keep increasing, Rotten Tomatoes is likely to lose the shreds of credibility they have left. The more manipulated these scores are and the higher the scores go, the less likely people are to trust them.
So I've got a question. He says that Rotten Tomatoes has a, quote, vested interest in giving trite, bland, woke movies good scores, because Rotten Tomatoes is owned by Warner Bros. And the ticket company Fandango, unquote. He continues, saying that the top executive of Fandango has close ties to Disney. My question is, how is ownership of Rotten Tomatoes by those major media and entertainment companies connected to wokeness? I acknowledge the conflict of interest here, and I do agree that it's an issue, but why wouldn't they just boost the scores of all the films they produce? If Warner Bros. And Fandango wanted to boost ticket sales, you would think that we would see consistently high reviews of at least movies produced by Warner Bros., because that's how they would make money. It doesn't matter if a woke movie is making money if it isn't one that Warner Bros. Produces. Now, as you may or may not know, Warner Bros. Owns DC Comics, which has produced some of the most famously critically panned movies of the past decade, the time since which Warner Bros. Bought Rotten Tomatoes. My question to Moon, how is it advantageous for Warner Bros. To have their own movies panned on a site that they own? I would think that the existence of these movies and their horrible Rotten Tomatoes critic scores is a much better indicator that there isn't obvious corporate meddling in Rotten Tomatoes scores.
When Rotten Tomatoes is giving Cuties and The Last Jedi these great scores and completely slamming people like Dave Chappelle, the public knew something was up. And to be honest, it's very likely that Disney's influence is to blame for the political wokeness that Rotten Tomatoes have been pushing. Not to mention them being slammed for being a platform of white straight men. And sadly, this has detracted from the site in numerous ways, be it the inflation of review scores or its new political agenda. And all of this has made people suspicious that big movie studios like Disney and Warner Bros. Are now warping the scores for their own agenda, which is why Rotten Tomatoes just doesn't have the integrity it once did. But to be fair, this all has its reasons. Progressivism is a cornerstone of corporate marketing. It helps your ESG score, and it helps you look like a happy, friendly company. So it's not really a surprise that Rotten Tomatoes had to fall in line. This is standard procedure in Hollywood, and it's why they folded to pressure and hired all those new critics.
Again, I'm just confused. If Warner Bros. Wanted to use Rotten Tomatoes to sell more tickets to their movies, they would only inflate the scores of movies that they produce, and probably deflate the scores of movies that their competition produces. But this clearly isn't what's happening, given the poor scores that many of their movies pull in, and the good scores that many of their competitors' movies pull in. So, where does the wokeness come from? How is it connected to any of this? Moon mentions that he thinks that wokeness is a good marketing strategy, but if that's the case, then why would Warner Bros. Be producing movies that the anti-woke crowd loves, like Joker? And how does that connect back to the Rotten Tomatoes scores anyhow? It apparently isn't connected by any real logic. I think that what's going on here instead is that Moon is, once again, flipping the script under our noses. Yes, the corporations do use some cynical pseudo-wokeness for marketing that has its own problematic aspects. But in this case, in this video, it's really Moon who's using wokeness as a marketing strategy. Wokeness has no other place in this video. It doesn't connect logically to any of his arguments. So the only reason that I can think of for him bringing it up is that he wants views. And nothing gets you views like tapping into a politically charged subject like wokeness, because the anti-woke crowd already exists as an entity of consumers who will eat up anything that blames wokeness for cultural trends they perceive as negative. That doesn't mean that Moon doesn't genuinely believe that Hollywood's push for wokeness is destroying the integrity of Rotten Tomatoes. He very well might. Any guess on my part as to the why in this video is going to involve a lot of speculation. But when I task myself with answering that question, that why, marketing is the only thing I can come up with. Because the logic to this argument, well, the logic just clearly isn't there. And yes, maybe I'm using wokeness for exposure myself here, just as I'm accusing Moon of doing. But I also clearly state my politically oriented motivations for this video multiple times throughout, so at least a cash grab isn't the only thing it could be.
And yet, the PR that Rotten Tomatoes hoped to gain from the move has backfired immensely. Instead of being praised for taking a side in the culture war, the site has only faced even more problems coming from the other side. There's been so many controversies stemming from films like The Last Jedi and how they performed on Rotten Tomatoes. Fans were apparently leaving bad reviews before the movie had been released, but even when it came out, the reviews just didn't get any better. The same problems cropped up with Captain Marvel and all the other woke garbage like it. But despite the overwhelming negative reactions, Rotten Tomatoes handpicked critics still give them good reviews and high scores. and all of these controversies have been awful for Rotten Tomatoes' public image, and some people believe that this isn't the furthest the Rotten Tomatoes have gone. There's rumours everywhere of Rotten Tomatoes tampering with scores, particularly surrounding movies made by Disney and Warner Bros. And from what we know about their ownership and management, there's definitely a motive there. Whether or not these rumours are actually true, they still reflect incredibly badly on Rotten Tomatoes' reputation. And to be fair, the rumours only crop up because people know that Rotten Tomatoes just isn't accurate anymore. The controversies, the mismatch between critics and the general inflation of review scores have all been awful for Rotten Tomatoes' reputation. What was once respected as a useful way of figuring out the quality of a movie has turned into a politically charged mess.
Sheesh. Politically charged mess is right, because that's the best way I can describe the video I just watched. I think I've already addressed most of the points he brings up in his conclusion prior to this, but I do feel the need to touch on a few things before I get to my conclusion and wrap this thing up. To start with, if audience members were already leaving negative reviews of The Last Jedi before they even saw it, doesn't that undermine the legitimacy of the audience score? The whole video, he seems to hold up the audience score as the holy scepter of objective truth in the face of the corrupt critic score. But how can the audience scores be any less corrupt if the audiences aren't even watching the movies, but are just attacking them based on the studio making them? And that's not even to mention the sampling bias I brought up previously. The next section is legitimately baffling. He describes corruption in the scores of, quote, Captain Marvel and all the other woke garbage like it, unquote. And just, the films he shows to back this point up make no sense to me. At first, I thought he was just showing examples of other movies that could be described as woke garbage, but I legitimately don't think that any of them fit the bill. I thought Venom was for the anti-woke crowd, and was panned because of it. And this is just a quick aside, but again, it makes no sense in the context of this video why Disney would put out an anti-woke movie and then still have it panned by critics in the scores that Disney manipulates, supposedly. But hey, what do I know? Maybe Disney, like Moon, knows that anti-wokeness is a good marketing strategy, and that bad scores will galvanize more of the anti-woke crowd to come out and see it out of anger against the woke overlords. Which, shit, maybe they did do that. Maybe the studios are playing both sides of it. That would actually make this whole narrative of connection between political marketing, studio interests, and critic scores make a whole lot more sense. Because while I do believe that sincere wokeness, being a concern with injustice and discrimination, is both good and necessary to have in our media, pseudo-wokeness can do a good deal to undermine that. And so I think it's important to distinguish between the two. Pseudo-wokeness, simply put, is the performance of wokeness, but with an ultimate goal that isn't actually social justice. Corporations are the parties most obviously guilty of this, when they use the image of protest or racial and sexual diversity, not because they believe that those things are positive for the advancement of social justice, but because they want to sell products. This can be seen everywhere from Pepsi commercials to Pride-themed products, all of which reduce the issues at hand to a marketing tool. Such an insincere performance of wokeness is a negative thing, because it delegitimizes sincere movements for social justice. Corporations so commonly using a cynical pseudo-wokeness in marketing allows people like Moon to paint all social justice movements, or attempts for better representation, as cynical power grabs, and ignore the real systemic oppression that sparks these movements in the first place. But separating corporations from the social justice movements that they exploit for profit wouldn't fit into Moon's narrative here. In his narrative, it is only wokeness, shoved down our throats by studios, that's causing the issue. The anti-woke side, representing the people, are always in the right, challenging the political order upheld by the studios in a David versus Goliath sort of scenario. This is why he wants us to believe that a chasm between critics and audience scores is so important, and that it only happens to woke movies. The problem with his David and Goliath narrative is that it not only ignores the real systemic oppression that gives rise to wokeness in the first place, but it also openly questions the sincerity of anyone who chooses to speak up against that oppression, lumping them in with studios and corporations pushing pseudo-wokeness when they are actually generally opposed to those entities. Back to the video. Okay, so if these aren't all examples of so-called woke garbage being praised by Rotten Tomatoes critics, then what are they? I'm not really sure, but it's honestly sort of a hilarious collection of movies that he threw up on screen here. I'm starting to think that it might be a bit of a troll job, and I'm just falling right into the trap by talking about the movies he puts up on screen while mentioning woke garbage, but it's just too good not to discuss. Setting aside Venom and We're the Millers as possible examples of anti-woke movies where there's still a wide chasm between critics and audience scores just flipped, let's look at the other movies here. First off, we've got Sausage Party, which, I mean, this must be a troll job, right? Sausage Party, despite the positive critical reviews here, is miles away from being woke. It's basically a movie for adolescent boys. It's chock full of gross-out humor, sexism, and racial stereotypes, which are all things that a movie presumed to be woke, whether truly woke or pseudo-woke, would veer far away from. Then we have Spy Kids, which came out in 2001, before the concept of wokeness was even born. Certainly before the culture war existed in Hollywood in its current form, so that must be a troll job as well. Passengers is a movie I did not know existed, but one that I don't really care to get into now that I do. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to take umbrage with in this section of the video is his statement that Rotten Tomatoes just isn't accurate anymore. My issue with this is largely the assumption that there's a possibility of accuracy here. By making this claim, Moon is shoehorning in the assumption that there is an objective standard for the quality of these movies that Rotten Tomatoes is no longer meeting. Yet, what would this objective standard be? Who gets to make it? Moon seems to be prodding us to assume that it is the audience which decides movie quality, but that contradicts directly with the claims he made earlier in the video. I mean, remember when he said that bringing on all the new and diverse critics from smaller publications would lower Rotten Tomatoes standards dramatically? Well, if this isn't blatant racism, which I'm sure Moon would dispute, it has to be a defense of institutionalism. But that means that the biggest journalistic institutions would be the ones who define objective standards for what makes a movie good. And that means that the audience score is useless, right? Because they don't have the qualifications to define movie quality. So then what was the whole point of pointing out the chasm between audience and critic scores? Wait, this is a question that we've already answered. His whole framework is built around institution-driven wokeness, and the chasm is the evidence of it. Although that evidence doesn't hold up. Now we're just going in a circle. The truth is that movie ratings aren't objective, because they are by their nature subjective. They are a way for a particular person to communicate to others how the movie impacted them. Whether you're a critic or an audience member, much in rating movies is incredibly personal, and can often come down to personal preference. This isn't to say that there aren't generally agreed upon standards of good and bad for certain aspects of movies, especially for technical aspects like special effects and CGI. You can often find the vast majority of movie watchers agreeing on the quality. But even then, some movies can use bad aspects to their advantage, such as by leveraging the campy nature of them for comedic effect, as we see in So Bad They're Good movies such as Troll 2 and The Room. The quality of any art is highly subjective, and it has to be, because art is meant to be consumed by people, and each person who consumes the art piece is going to approach it with their own unique perspective, and therefore take away something unique from their experience in consuming it, based upon their own individual background. I know that might sound like a lot of artsy-fartsy bullshit, but it is something that I truly believe in, and relates to a concept that is popular among the online literary community called Death of the Author, which I think deserves further reading if you're interested. Overall, I think the ability of art to engage in a dialogue with its consumer is what makes it worthwhile. Art is nothing without a viewer, and a viewer is different from any other viewer. And what's the alternative, otherwise? That there is objectivity in movies? Then what's the point in even discussing movies? What's the point in interpreting them or analyzing them? Hell, what's even the point in seeing them? If it's already been decided that a movie is or isn't of a certain quality, then there's no point in viewing it, because there's nothing new that you can get out of it by viewing it. Again, it's an inherently subjective experience, and that's the point. All that's to say that criticizing Rotten Tomatoes for inaccuracy is missing the point of film criticism entirely, and honestly, it just makes me sad. So if neither critics nor audience scores are objective, can either of them be right? Well, not really. Like I addressed earlier, critics and audiences are rating movies on Rotten Tomatoes for entirely different reasons, and coming from rather different perspectives in doing so. If you appreciate films that are more on the artistic side, and that are more willing to break the conventions of Hollywood, you'll probably appreciate the perspective of critics more, although critics do still vary dramatically. And if you appreciate films that more closely abide by Hollywood's conventions, and that speak more directly to the wider cultural taste, you'll probably appreciate the perspective of audiences more. Neither is more valid than the other. In that case, does the chasm between the scores matter? I feel like it's the 1000th time I've asked this question. Well, even though I think that Moon is making a faulty argument in his video, I wouldn't go as far as to say that they don't matter. If critics and audience scores are further apart than they used to be, which the Bloomberg article seems to substantiate, there very well might be something interesting to look into here. Perhaps the widespread availability of new media sources that has undermined the supremacy of mainstream media has led to a greater divergence of opinion overall in our society, which isn't reflected in the critics' scores since so many of them are still with mainstream media institutions. Perhaps many of us are now conditioned by the argumentative nature of social media discourse to disagree with others, and in doing such are now tending to disagree more with the posted critics' scores on Rotten Tomatoes. And perhaps, like I worryingly posited earlier, audiences are becoming more reactionary. It's a topic big enough for an hour-long video of its own, hopefully one which utilizes sociological analysis. It certainly deserves more than 12 minutes of nonsense anti-woke baiting backed up by nothing. At this point, if you're still here, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that seems like a lot of time and energy sunk into something that, at the end of the day, isn't all that shocking or offensive. And to that, I respond, I agree. I do. I really, really do. When I started out this video, I thought that it would just be a quick critique of Moon's argument here, hopefully no more than 15 minutes in length. But as I watched his video carefully and started writing, more and more just kept coming up that I felt the need to address. And I honestly think that that's the key to this sort of content, and that's why I've spent so much energy in responding to it. Beneath a surface that is mundane, apparently apolitical, and designed for a casual and general audience, there is a whole system of highly politicized ideas. And if those ideas aren't explicitly exposed and countered, they'll be allowed to run rampant. Moon's video may look, on the surface, like a Wikipedia synopsis, a vaguely interesting chunk of factual information delivered quickly and painlessly on the reasons for Rotten Tomatoes' declining figures. Yet, the argument that he puts forth is one that relies on assumptions of white supremacy and misogyny that are incredibly dangerous, and not only lie at the root of many of today's social inequalities, but also form the basis for the normalization of right-wing persuasion tactics and theories that are key to building right-wing movements that intend to continue this oppression into the future. The ideology of anti-wokeness is built on excluding from media and political representation those who aren't white men. It is built on protecting the idea that any movement away from white male hegemony represents the unjust oppression of white males. It is part of a collection of largely online ideas or movements, alongside things such as the manosphere, that form the breeding grounds for mass shooters such as Peyton Gendron and Brenton Tarrant, both of whom were radicalized online and live-streamed their hate crimes for those online communities to view. So yeah, it might seem a bit absurd or even petty for me to go after Moon so hard here for a video of his that seems pretty innocuous. But it is exactly the fact that the video seems innocuous that scares me. This is precisely the sort of content, apparently moderate on the surface, but with a pit of increasingly extreme ideas underlying it, that acts as a first step in the right-wing radicalization of young white men across the West. Because of that, I do think that it's important to call this out and expose those ideas that Moon is hiding, that he may not even know underlie his video. And I think it's important to show just how illogical his reasoning is, because apparently people think that it's the smartest shit on the planet. Yeah, it isn't. It's Moon mixing up pseudo-wokeness with wokeness without defining anything clearly, and constructing out of that mess his own political narrative of studio-imposed oppressive wokeness that doesn't really match up to reality at all. And the icing on top of the cake here, the part that really solidifies this video as a portal to the right wing, is the self-victimization. This is a centerpiece of right-wing ideology on the whole. Many core conservative policies come from the idea that white men are victims of an attack, which is usually, in reality, just an attempt by marginalized groups to gain some sort of societal equality. To give some examples, the policy of anti-immigration stems, at least partially, from the fear that white people will be replaced and then oppressed by non-whites. The demonization of trans people stems from the fear that the patriarchy will be undermined, as it relies on strict gender boundaries that queerness challenges. So, even though immigrants of color and trans people in the US both face systemic oppression at the hands of a white male system, right-wing ideology uses the unjustified fear of white men that they will be the victims of the members of these groups if they gain any hint of power as an excuse to continue to greedily hold on to all of the power. Moon is playing right into this by presenting right-wing comedians and audience members as the real victims here, which is patently absurd. I'll refer again to that JD Signifier video. Watch it. Learn. What are we left with then? What are the final takeaways? Well, on the one hand, Moon's ability to use eye-catching editing and flash frames of studies and news articles is a highly effective method of making his arguments seem factual, while disguising the underlying ideology that they support. This does require skill, and may be grounds for applause. On the other hand, though, this video is filled with loose argumentation, nonsensical logical leaps, thinly veiled racism and misogyny, a confused relationship with corporatism, and a general lack of clarity. As far as I'm concerned, Moon should take a hard look at the legitimacy of his claims, and the effect that they have on the world. Maybe then we could actually learn something real and begin to cease with the onslaught of dangerous content. That's it. I'm done. I'm finished for real. Goddamn. I know I sort of towed the line between video essay and commentary in this video, which might make it seem pretty rambly, but hopefully it made sense and hopefully it worked. Hopefully I at least got the points across through repetition, if that's it. But, let me know what you thought about the video in the comments down below. And if you like this, please hit the like or even subscribe. Just please, please do not forget to pack your lunch. Mommy loves you.